I'm Alan Wardis, and you're listening to Think Radio.
So this was kind of the university's response to these students being on campus, was to begin to take their tuition away.
So university leadership wanted diversity.
Yeah, subservient diversity, I suppose, would be the best way to put that.
That's documentary filmmaker Nicole Esquibel talking about her new film, Neva Romero, Jamas Olvidados. It's the little-known story of Chicano activism in 1970s Boulder, Colorado, that ended in violent tragedy. Stay tuned to this episode of Think Radio.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison's locally owned hometown newspaper, and by the Western State Colorado University Office of Academic Affairs. Think Radio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can become a Think Radio patron, visit alanwardesmedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
Nicole, thanks for joining me. I really appreciate the visit.
I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah. Enjoyed the movie last night. We screened it at the University Theater, and what a powerful film. But I have to say that I find the title to your film just a little bit ironic. Jamas Olvidados.
Yeah.
Never forgotten.
Yeah.
And yet this is a story that most people never knew in the first place.
Right. Well, I'm using that title as hopefully moving forward. You know, it feels like Los Seis and Neva Romero's story has been actually, in many cases, erased from the history of Boulder and of Colorado. So my goal was to, from this point forward with this film, that we don't lose the story of Los Seis and Neva Romero. And I think we had a great dialogue around that sort of notion last night about who makes history, how history is actually put into place and then taken back, or just completely erased from the historical memory of a community.
Right. We like to think that history is a factual and accurate representation of what happened, but that's not always the case. Well, so let's take a minute in our conversation to just bring us up to speed. Most people will have not heard of Neva Romero. They will not know what you mean when you say Los Seis de Boulder. Mm-hmm. What's the story there?
The story is multifaceted, but it begins with a young woman who was born in Ignacio, Colorado, was high school prom queen, president of her student council, excellent student, was accepted up to the University of Colorado at Boulder, along with a number of Mexican-American students all over the state of Colorado. There was a giant push for Mexican-American representation at the University of Colorado. And so she was part of this.
And what year are we in now?
Well, the program itself began in the late 60s, but Neva Romero started in 1972. So she's up there at the University of Boulder. She is becoming aware of her own Mexican-American heritage and the history of the Mexican-American experience in the United States, and her consciousness is being raised.
And it's not like she's doing this by herself. She goes to Boulder and finds that there's already this Chicano rights movement happening. And so she's plugged into this sort of zeitgeist of the time, which involved a lot of different things, not just Chicano rights. And wanting to set the stage in 1972 in Boulder, there was a lot of activism going on.
Yeah, the Vietnam War was being protested. Obviously, the African-American civil rights movement was in full bloom and had continued on. So it was part of a larger sort of student activist movement that was taking place across the campus. And there was a lot of student activism taking place at other universities across Colorado, but CU Boulder was definitely the hub for a majority of the student activist protests that were taking place at the time.
So Neva arrives in this atmosphere, and it really starts to resonate.
Yeah, it was in full bloom when she arrived at the university. So she becomes a student, gets elected to student senate. Actually, an entire slate of Chicano students sort of begins to have power at the university. So for a number of years leading up to, for about 2 years, the university was trying to figure out how they could control this student-run organization known as UMAS, the United Mexican-American Student Association. And the way that they found that they could do it was by cutting off or limiting their financial aid packages. And so students were finding that they didn't have money for books, for tuition, for housing, for food. And so they began to protest. And there were a number of sit-ins, there were a number of building takeovers from about the end of 72 until the middle of 74. So this was kind of the university's response to these students being on campus, was to begin to take their tuition away.
So university leadership wanted diversity.
Yeah, subservient diversity, I suppose, would be the best way to put that. You know, they wanted them to come up and not be rabble-rousers. There was a lot of examination of the curriculum that was taking place at the University of Colorado. These students were demanding that there be a Chicano studies program so that they could examine their history, more Spanish classes, foreign language classes. So those things were taking place as well.
And this is at the same time that the United Farm Workers were at the height of their activism.
Well, the farm workers had been going on for a long period of time, since the 60s, but the UMass students, definitely their ability to organize and protest and boycott led itself to working with the United Farm Workers Union, looking at protesting Safeway, boycotting grapes. But one of the larger boycotts that actually was quite successful that UMass helped work with was the boycott of Coors beer. Joseph Coors had a strong, deep relationship with the University of Colorado. He sat on the board of trustees and had made some racially disparaging remarks about Mexican Americans and Chicanos. And so the students successfully boycotted Coors beer on the CU Boulder campus, also went to many of the liquor stores around the Boulder area. So between the United Farm Workers and boycotting grapes and Safeway, the second sort of boycott that they were equally successful in implementing was Coors beer.
Well, and so let's jump ahead just a little bit in the story in order to sort of tease the outcome here and why this is such an important tale to tell and why you believe it should never be forgotten. Because the story of Neva Romero ends with a car bombing. I mean, and when I think of car bombings, I think of Bogota or Beirut, not Boulder, Colorado. So from this atmosphere of protest that you've described, how do we get to the point where bombs are blowing up?
Well, the idea of using a transportable bomb wasn't invented by UMass or MAP or any of the other student organizations on the University of Colorado campus. Bombings were taking place all along the Front Range of Colorado from the early 1970s until well after the bombing that killed Neva Romero. I remember reading an article somewhere, I think it was in the Rocky Mountain News at one point, that 1974 was considered the year of the bombing. So there were so many bombings that were taking place all across Colorado, and they were not used in ways to harm people or kill or maim individuals. That came along a lot later, I think. They were used as political statements because there were so many young activist groups out there looking to get their voices heard that there was no way in which they could unless they actually
blew something up or, made a loud noise.
Right, exactly. So it wasn't uncommon for these things to take place. They were happening outside of post offices, other government buildings. They were happening outside of police stations, in mailboxes. And it wasn't just Colorado, Front Range, Boulder incidents. This was happening nationwide.
Sure, it was the Weather Underground days. It also wasn't a Chicano movement event in particular. It was other groups, other political ideologies that were trying to be heard.
Yeah, all across campus. I mean, the Black Student Union was also protesting on the CU campus because they were also having issues around financial aid. So it was just a heightened time for student activism that began primarily, I think, with the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War and continued forward to these other causes.
Because I must admit, I didn't know anything about this story.
Yeah.
I've been in Colorado for quite some time. I didn't grow up here, but I'd never heard about this story. And also, I wouldn't have known that 1974 was the year of the bomb in Colorado. That's not something that we recite in our history. You know, last night someone asked that question of you, and you said, well, because when we think about Colorado history, what are we thinking of? What are we more likely to tell the kids about? And you listed off some fairly humorous examples, I thought. They'll know more about Alfred Packer and the cannibalism that took place in Lake City. They'll know more about Molly Brown and how unsinkable she was. But they're not likely to know about these things.
Yeah.
So on the campus in 1972, the Chicano movement was gaining traction. They were trying to be heard. But I still don't know how Neva Romero died in a bombing. You've put together these pieces. You've pulled on these threads. What do you think it was that led to that event? And she wasn't the only one. I mean, the Los Seis, that refers to 6 people that were killed in these bombings.
Yeah.
What happened? How did we get to that point?
From what I can gather from the stories that I've heard, there was a lot of frustration that was being built up within UMass, the larger Chicano rights movement, as to action that needed to be taken place. The university was struggling to hear the voices of these young people. They had taken over a couple of buildings. They had met with the governor to sort of try and resolve these financial issues, and nothing was taking place. So in the early May of 1974, a group of UMass students decided they were going to take over a building on the CU campus known as TB1, which was Temporary Building 1. It's still there. It's still called TB1, even though it's considered to be a temporary building. And it looks very, very much the same as it did back in that spring of 74. And so they took over the building. 8 students took it over and began to demand that the change take place. One of the changes that they wanted to take place immediately was the university had put into power over the UMass organization 2 gentlemen. One was named Joe Franco and the other was named Paul Acosta. And they were not always aligned with the mission and values of the UMass students. And there's a humorous story in the film when, well, I don't know if it's humorous, but it's a story of the fact that when a lot of these students were protesting their financial aid and not getting their financial aid package, Joe Franco took a bunch of his students up to a ski resort and skied for the day. And meanwhile, the students who were occupying this building didn't even have an opportunity to feed themselves. So this group of UMass students took over TB1 and the sit-in began. And they stayed there for a while, not to give away too much of the film, but, you know, there were tense negotiations that were taking place between the Boulder police, the Boulder campus police, the administration, and these UMass students, and no resolution seemed to be in sight. And then we get to the date of May 27th, 1974, when Neva Romero, along with Reyes Martinez and Una Jacola, are up at the Chautauqua Auditorium parking lot, and a car bomb happens. And that sort of rocked the world of all of these students who were sitting in TB1, because you could hear it. You know, Boulder's a small town. A bomb goes off. Everybody's going to know that it took place.
And so these 3 people were in a car at the Chautauqua Park, and it exploded.
Yes. And
no chance of survival. I mean, this was a violent explosion.
It was horrific. And immediately, IDs were found. The Boulder police went to the apartment of Neva Romero, began to question her roommates about the situation. The roommates went up to TB1 and said, "Hey, the police are questioning us about Neva, and she was supposedly up at Chautauqua in a part of this car bombing that took place." And so it definitely rattled the UMass group. People were upset. The ironic part about this whole story is that 2 days later, the exact same thing happened outside a liquor store in Boulder, Colorado, where 3 more Chicano rights activists were killed in the exact same way.
So one of the things you learn in law enforcement is not to trust coincidence.
Mm-hmm.
That if something happens once, a lot of factors could be at play. Something happens twice, now you've got a pattern. Now you've got a trend. So I'm assuming that law enforcement would have been all over that. And they would have started asking the question, who's targeting these Chicano activists? Is that what happened?
I think immediately they thought that Chicano rights activists weren't being targeted, but that they were actually the ones who were detonating bombs. That they were making bombs and really didn't know what they were doing. And I've seen some of the Boulder Sheriff's reports that link the problem to the timing device that, according to the Boulder Sheriff's reports, were purchased at a Woolworth store. They bought 2 Timex watches that were going to be the timing devices, and supposedly these timing devices did not work properly. So that, according to the Boulder police, the Boulder coroner, they were trying to set these bombs using these Timex watches. They weren't experts at this sort of thing, and the bombs went off.
And they were doing this in their car.
Right, yes. They were doing it in a car for the second case, in a parking lot where there's a Burger King right next door to a liquor store.
Uh-huh. And this happens twice within 2 days of each other.
Correct.
And you would think that the second group of 3 might have said, what happened 2 days ago? Neva Romero died in one of these blasts. Maybe we should be more careful with our bomb. I mean, I'm expressing the kind of skepticism that I would assume would have been a part of this conversation. That doesn't add up to me.
Yeah.
That doesn't smell right. I mean, in all of your research, what do you think? I mean, does that seem plausible to you, that these people were just victims of their own violent intentions?
For me personally, I don't believe so. I think there's too many coincidences, and it talks about that a lot in the film and lists them out as to what could have possibly happened that evening. For me, if we add on to the list of coincidences, it's not a coincidence that 6 of the people in the car who are killed, and then one person is severely injured, whose story isn't in the film but lived from that second bombing, were all leaders within the movement. If there was a reason for 6 people to be killed, these were significant individuals to eliminate from the Chicano rights movement, to eliminate from UMAS.
Well, and you suggest in the film that there's proof for that idea in the fact that the movement pretty much died on the spot.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, all of the momentum that they had gained was suddenly gone, and you have really compelling testimony from people who were actually there and talking about how they suddenly didn't know who to trust, couldn't trust each other even.
Yeah.
Well, that's a pretty good outcome if what you had in mind was to destroy the movement, or at least to make them think twice.
Yeah, which was a significant opportunity for especially government officials. One of the things I go into is the COINTELPRO organization, counterintelligence program that the FBI had, and it had for a number of years. There's a lot of documentation out there, but that began with surveilling the Puerto Rican nationalist movement back in the late 50s, I believe. But the COINTEL program's mission was to infiltrate a lot of these student groups, leftist-leaning groups, and cause disorder and chaos. Mm-hmm. So if that was the purpose of the COINTELPRO movement, and they were to do this, these 2 horrific bombings, they definitely succeeded in breaking up the UMAS movement and shattering the momentum that these students were building on the CU campus.
ThinkRadio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper. ThinkRadio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can join the ThinkRadio community of patrons, visit alanwartismedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
And so let's talk about the movement for a moment, because for a lot of people, the word Chicano doesn't really have a whole lot of meaning. I went to Wikipedia and I looked up the word Chicano, and it says that it's an assumed identity, that it's a philosophy as much as it is an ethnic group.
Yeah.
In all your research, what did you learn about that? About what was in the mind of these people who were suddenly calling themselves Chicano, a word that had been sort of pejorative.
Right.
even among Mexican Americans. So what was the threat that was posed by these people saying, no, we are Chicano and we're proud of it?
Yeah, I think it's much like any sort of marginalized group who begins to co-opt the oppressor's language, co-opt the oppressor's ideas, and reform them into their own identity, their own shape. You know, there is some threat to individuals educating themselves, learning about their history, taking that history and shaping their own identity in a new way that doesn't conform itself to the dominant ideology that exists.
Because that's by definition empowering.
Exactly. And so that's what these students are doing and we're doing, and beginning to challenge and question notions of colonization, notions of the English language, notions of migrant status in the United States.
Well, and systemic discrimination.
Right.
I mean, so one thing that a lot of people don't realize is while throughout the South, black people were met with signs that said no coloreds on water fountains and restaurants, the same thing was happening to Mexican American people, particularly all across the western United States. And so the struggle was very similar. This whole Chicano side of that story is one we don't really tell ourselves very often.
Right. Yeah. I was actually having a really interesting discussion about this with somebody last night that, you know, we acknowledged the civil rights movement of African Americans in this country, and yet we sort of marginalized the Chicano rights movement. And I think that in many ways, generally speaking, the reason that we do that is because of the white guilt of slavery that took place. That there's this notion of we can't hide from the fact that we enslaved Africans and brought them to this country and built the country on the backs of the labor of these people. We just can't hide from it. So we got to acknowledge it somehow. So let's acknowledge the civil rights movement of the 60s, 50s, 60s, and it alleviates some of that guilt. But the same thing was happening across the Southwest, you know, but it was considered to be the Wild West, where savages roamed and we had to conquer them of sorts, and in order for us to manifest our destiny, right? Mm-hmm. So we build up the idea of conquering the plains and don't feel guilt about that. So we have no reason to acknowledge the Chicano rights movement or the American Indian movement, which was taking place at the exact same time. I mean, it's sort of interesting because in many ways the Chicano rights movement was working hand in hand with the American Indian movement. But, you know, we don't really ever discuss those things. We don't have a Leonard Peltier Day, right? We don't. Right. As a matter of fact, he's still jailed in prison and forgotten, you know. Yeah. We have two Chicano rights individuals that are highly lauded, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, but there's so many other people who were involved in that movement. You know, even if we look at the African American movement, we really haven't dug deep to see who other heroes of that movement are. You know, we've got our big three. Yeah. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and then, Stokely Carmichael's doing some stuff, you know.
Well, so your film arrives on the scene 40 plus years later. Do you see evidence today that this culture of silence around these issues is starting to change? I mean, we've got Black Lives Matter on the landscape. Mm-hmm. We've got the whole debate about dreamers and what that means. You know, is there positive progress on this front, in your opinion?
It depends on the day you ask me. Boy, I really see us fracturing even more so around issues around race and immigration, migration, dreamers. You know, a lot of the protests that were taking place, those are all exciting. Even the March for Our Lives that took place, it's interesting to see young people begin to initiate change, much like Neva Romero and the UMA students did.
Well, because that's one thing that's different, that almost all of those movements came to an end around that time. Right? I mean, everything just sort of petered out. The anti-war movement, civil rights movement very much went underground. Do you see any of that?
The women's rights movement, the gay liberation movement, all
correct.
Sort of, in the era of Reagan especially, yeah.
It's been hard for activists to reignite any of that excitement? Do you see that any of that is changing in the attitudes of young people?
Yes, I'm actually extremely positive because I teach at the college level. So I see these young people, and I'm excited about the activism that is possible for them and the doors that are opening. But I also think that it depends on where you are in the country. I think in California it's much more easy to see signs of strong activism taking place, whereas in other parts of the country it's not happening.
Well, you live in Kansas City.
Yeah.
That's as heartland as it gets.
Right.
What are you seeing there?
I'm seeing a great divide. I'm seeing students that are really becoming active, taking on issues, tackling issues. And then I see students who have grown up with their parents watching Fox News all day long and are very much pro-Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And so there seems to be in Kansas City amongst young people a great unspoken divide. Like there's a lot of issues that are on the periphery that no one seems to want to talk about beyond their small little siloed group of friends.
So we've got a lot of work to do.
Yes, we've got a lot of work to do. And
more obvious every day.
I had a conversation with a young woman yesterday who is a young Latina who is one of the few families in Gunnison of Mexican-American descent, and she talked about the racism that she's experienced. And for her, she doesn't see as much positive activism as you can turn on the TV and see on the coast.
Well, and this is a community that I think prides itself and would tell you that it's more progressive than most. Mm-hmm. And yet still here's this voice of somebody living here saying, the reality may not be quite so rosy.
Yeah.
Well, so let's shift gears a minute because you're a filmmaker.
Mm-hmm.
You've described yourself last night as more of an experimental filmmaker.
Yeah.
And yet you've taken this dive into making documentaries. What's that experience been like for you?
With my experimental films, there was always a part of me that was infused into the film, the narrative of the film. Obviously, technically, I'm a part of every aspect of whatever film I make. But within the narrative of the film, there was always a part of me that was kind of infused into it in one form or another. And in this film, I really felt like I was personally the most distant from the subject matter. Really, the story is their story. I just had to kind of tell it. And I've liked that. It's been freeing to sort of investigate, understand, build relationships with people, and have them tell their story. It's far more interesting at some point.
Well, so in light of the fact that these days we generally accept that news media is a mixed bag. I mean, all the way from fake to just not entirely reliable. Do you think the documentary film has a role to play in sort of re-educating ourselves about what's really going on?
Maybe it's the optimist in me, but I see some of the work that's coming out of respected journalism, and I'm excited about it. I think that there's really some great stuff that's taking place. I see journalists working harder than ever to sort of stem the tide of fake news, and the role of the documentary filmmaker is more essential now than ever. The hard part, of course, is to get across the din of all the fake news that's going on. How do I puncture the bubble or rupture the fabric of how people view the world so that they are able to see a different viewpoint? And that's, I think, where story comes in. Even though no one knows about Neva Romero and Los Seis de Boulder, there's something compelling about their story that we're willing to take a journey with them and discover who they are.
Well, I hope so. And so the film is just beginning to make its way into the world, right?
Yeah. Actually, it premiered last September at Chautauqua Auditorium in Boulder.
That had to be powerful.
Yeah, it was surreal, I have to say.
Well, so when can the public see this film? Because I know when a film begins its life, it makes its way through festivals and private screenings or limited screenings.
Yeah.
What's your plan?
That's a good question, what my plan is. Well, tomorrow night, this evening, I'll be in Durango, Colorado at Fort Lewis. And then I head off to Ignacio, which is the small town in which Neva Romero grew up in. And I'm excited to show it there. Next week, I'll be back up in Boulder to screen it, Pueblo, and then I'm going to probably tour the Southwest with it. You know, I think there's a lot of interest, especially in places like New Mexico, Arizona, California. This film has kind of taken on an academic quality to it, so it feels like even though it's going to film festivals, it's also being shown in classrooms, primarily around ethnic studies, Latina studies, even film studies programs have shown an interest in the film. So there's definitely this collegiate track that the film seems to be taking. So I'm really interested in that. I've had a great experience here at Western meeting students. Yesterday, I sat in a class on a Spanish class, an anthropology class, and a filmmaking class. And we all discussed the film from those different sort of disciplines. And it was just an amazing time. So I look forward to doing that as much as I do taking it to film festivals.
So clearly, as a filmmaker, there's a message that you want your audience to know after seeing your film. But here's another question that goes a little deeper. What do you want people to do?
You know, I guess I want them to see this film, especially young people, and realize that action can be taken in their lives. This seems to be a time in which participation in one's own life is essential. And not just, you know, I'm getting an education, I'm going to get a job, I'm going to raise kids, but actually looking at community engagement and issues around social justice, that these young people get involved in that. And I hope that in a short way that Neva Romero's life and the example by which she lived can show that you can come from some small town in Ignacio and participate in larger issues such as bilingual education and issues around migrancy and women's rights.
Well, Nicole, thanks for your work, and best of luck getting this film in front of lots of people.
Thank you. This has been great.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper.
Think Radio is a production of Alan Wardis Media. The show's executive producer is Issa Forrest. Associate producer, Kat Seibert. Original music by Issa Forrest. New episodes are available for download every Monday morning on iTunes and at alanwardismedia.com. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Think Radio.